Great. Okay, so hey everyone. It's actually very nice to see a lot of you here. Already the introductions were given, and it's always very nice to hear your CV dictated to you, and you're like, it's almost like a happy birthday. You just don't know what to do. But yeah, okay. So I'm going to firstly share the PowerPoint, and then sort of outline what the goals are, and then we can start. Just let me figure out how this works, because I suck at this. Great. Just everyone can see this, I assume, and then I think this is working fine.
Yep, it's working fine.
Amazing. Great. So just a few things before we start and jump into it. So how did I imagine this to work? The goal of this workshop is to sort of be, reasonably short, like 45 minutes to an hour, where I will try to go over all of the relevant things about narrative debates, all the other types of rounds that exist, and then how you can approach it in like a time efficient way to cover everything, and then basically, smash those types of rounds. I personally really love narrative debates, and a lot of speakers struggle with it, especially sometimes novices. So I'm really excited for this. Also, then to clarify just before we start, that there is another workshop that I think is excellent on narratives from Hadar Goldberg. You can find it on YouTube. I've also linked it in the last slide. I've also looked at Hadar's workshop. It's great. It does last for like 2 hours. So she goes a bit more into depth in more like how you weigh stuff and, rebuttals, etc., which are more like, I would say, formative things, like interacting with other teams in other cases. This is mostly just going to be sort of trying to push you into the right direction, when you see the motion, and then how you're going to approach your own case, your own burdens, etc. So this is the goal of my workshop, but I do highly encourage you to also look at the other one. Cool, so now we can start. The basic question, like what are narrative debates? I assume that most of us already know what a narrative is, and a message or idea or a norm that exists in a society. Note that I didn't put here necessarily that it is like a dominant one, or because it doesn't have to be. It also depends on the context of the motion, etc. So I've divided this into the 3 types of motions and approaches that we're going to cover. The first one being like the general or dominant narratives, like as this house opposes the narrative, which is stay productive during lockdown. Also going to realize I have tried to use as many possible examples as I could in this PowerPoint in terms of motions. Secondly, all of the glorification, idealization, romanticization, those do happen very often. I think we've all seen them done a lot of times. I've included here, this also gets the glorification of parenthood. And the third one, the third thing I wanted to cover is specifically social movements, because very often in debates, there are some, actors that carry a narrative or are trying to push a narrative into the society. I'm also just going to quickly also cover that. How do you deal with a narrative once that it's, pushed from a social movement's perspective? And the example here is the feminist movement to advocate for the abolition of marriage. Cool, let's start. How do we approach basic narratives? So this house opposes whatever, X narrative or dominant narrative. The crucial thing that I think is probably the most important thing in this entire workshop is characterization. Because narratives are obviously, let's say, these sort of ideas and sort of not tangible things, but it do impact all of us in like on a certain level, right? And I think very often the benefits or the impacts that you want to claim in a round really don't have to be huge, right? I don't think that narratives very often do change the world, but they matter a lot, obviously, to humans and how we perceive the world around us, how we perceive our relationships, how we carry ourselves, etc. And I think once you grasp the full characterization of what a narrative is, as soon as your prep time starts, they're going to be, this characterization is going to be a building block for your argumentation to arise from it, right? So here I have 5 things that you're supposed to keep in mind. It looks like there is a lot of them, but they're actually quite simple, right? So the first one is the interpretation of the narrative, okay? So how does this narrative look like? I think very often we can see, let's use the, glorification of motherhood, right? And I think teens are just gonna be like, oh, well, women are mothers and we love our mothers. And that's like sort of basically it. Like I'm just sort of, being funny. But, I think for you to characterize the interpretation of the narrative or what it means to define the narrative in a round, you have to think in the most tangible way that you can, right? So what are the words that are behind this narrative? Like the pictures in your mind that that you hear as a person when you hear this narrative, you're like, okay, this is what it means. Basically the sentences or things that you can see posted on social media, etc. right? Also, how often do you probably engage with this narrative? So this is like the first basic bit of I'm now defining my narrative. Secondly, is how is this narrative communicated to you, right? So who are the carriers? This is also very often for your argumentation to be strong, because for narrative to matter and be relevant to people, also very often it's attached to the actors that we very often care about, right? So it is our friends, family, or we, do see it on like social media and like get these sort of impulses of information in our brain, celebrities that we might fancy, also politicians that sort of have a lot of media space. So it's very important to pinpoint who the carriers are. Thirdly is how do individuals internalize narratives? Because we hear this verb quite a lot in rounds, but internalizing means so that this exists around me, right? This is a narrative. Let's say glorify motherhood, and then from my family, I hear it, oh, you're going to be like such a good mom, or I can't wait to have grandkids, etc. Blah blah. These types of things, right? But then how do I internalize it, right? Or it means how does it affect my worldview? So is it going to create some sort of expectations in terms of, how am I going to be a good mother, or for my children, or for my husband? How important is this to me then? So if it is communicated to me a lot by the people that I do care about, what trade-offs am I willing to then make, right? So am I going to probably work less or not find the same, career, because I really, really have been convinced that I should be a mother and it's going to be a great experience. So this is sort of the third approach, which is, okay, how does then this narrative impact the actor's worldview, or however you want to analyze? Fourthly, is then, which I think is just the logical extension of all three, which is how does this narrative impact behavior? Because then obviously, if the narrative exists, the actors that I care about, tell me, that I should care about this. I sort of then base my expectations of my life on it. It does sort of then lead me to, oh, well, I'm probably also going to act in a way that I will want to be a mother, right? Or I will most likely want to be a mother. So I think that you can claim behavior of actors once all of these first three steps are made. And lastly, which is very important based on context, is what are the other narratives and incentives that might empower or mitigate this narrative? So an example here would be something that can empower this narrative would be the entire, let's say, monogamy or traditional marriage narrative that we have that is also then combined and empowers the motherhood narrative, or mitigate it in let's say the modern liberal wave of you're not supposed to be a housewife, you're supposed to work, be a a boss bitch or whatever, right? So it's always important to remember that we do not exist in a vacuum, and that we all interact with many other narratives, that we as humans care about different things. And I think that is going to be just relevant in every round to sort of then see, what are the alternatives that I can still claim that can get me the impacts? Meaning, if opposition likes something specifically about motherhood, I can say, oh, but we're still going to have, you're still probably going to want to have some sort of a family, find a husband, etc. Or it's useful to know then in terms of rebuttal and prepare yourself, what are the mitigations that can accrue to your narrative. Now, something I really like is mini exercise time. And I know there's a lot of you here, and I like to have interactive workshops. So this is very simple. Let's put all of these rules that we just covered into context. So the example is, this house regrets the nominal narrative that romantic love is the primary source of fulfillment in life. So the narrative that you have to characterize or define is romantic love is the primary source of fulfillment in life. I would like you guys to take 5 minutes. I'm going to go back on the slide and go over the rules and apply them to characterize dominant narrative. So to just tell me, what does this look like? Who is talking about this? What are the, who are the carriers? Why do I, as an actor, would care about it? How is it going to impact my behavior, etc. Here in the end, I just put a very simple memo technique. Is that how it's translated? How, who, and why, and then that is going to lead to action, and always think about other narratives. But now I'm going to try to go back to the previous slide to All right, so I'll give you guys a few minutes of time. So it's romantic love is the primary source of fulfillment in life. It feels they need more time. If not, then great, we can start discussing. Okay, so on romantic love is the primary source of fulfillment in life. Is there anyone who wants to tell me how does the interpretation of this narrative look like? So the first bit.
I have an analogy or example or something. I can't pinpoint the exact word that is. I think we can talk about how in movies there's oftentimes a man or a woman who is in a very bad situation, who does not have any happiness in life, and they find like this damsel in distress. They help them, they get love, and finding that love happens to be a happy ending, and that's how romantic love is glorified.
Mm-hmm. I like that a lot. Anyone else? Come on, guys. I know there's a lot of you here.
Okay, not exactly. How do I say this? A lot of time, what romantic love is portrayed as is in, or people tend to uh, think that romantic love is basis for social validation and acceptance, because your peers may be having a romantic relationship and you may be not, and that could make you feel not exactly efficient or not socially acceptable. I don't think I'm really explaining it that well, but what I want to say is it's a form of romantic love is a lot of times a form of validation. People tend to think that it is a form of validation to have a romantic partner and having someone significant to yourself.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so first you already jumped into argumentation. So this is, we're building the ground for that argument to be strong, right? So we're just looking at the characterization. Is there anyone else who wants to add on this? So on the interpretation? Also, just a quick question. Is this this part of the workshop is not being recorded, right?
I'll stop the recording. We'll edit it out. We'll edit this particular part.
All right, great. So there's nothing that you can do
Hi.
as well, or like some sort of hints as to what the correct answer was, although there is no correct answer, but you know what I mean. All right, amazing. Let's move on to the second bit. Glorification, idealization, and romanticization. They're very similar. They do just have slight nuances. What you always have to do when you get this motion is not only then to think about the basic, the narrative, what the narrative looks like, but what either of these three words actually, what do they mean and how do they manifest? So glorification often means lifting a narrative or whatever, an actor on some sort of like a pedestal, right? So we glorify them, we sort of look up to them, and we think, this person, is infallible or whatever. So this also regrets the glorification of motherhood. So we're raising, we're looking up to mothers. Most people want to be a mother, etc. I think idealization here is very similar. I just think it sort of refers to like an image or a narrative being like perfect or ideal and something that most people just should enjoy, right? So although we do glorify individuals and we do want to be like them, I think idealization is most of like you're striving towards this sort of perfection or ideal that is sort of portrayed here. So I think the example here was, I can't see due to the grid, but I see modern idealization of civil rights leaders as moderate, pacifist, and respectable, right? So we had this idealization of civil rights leaders as being these sorts of things. And romanticization is, I think, a very fun one because it's also very similar. I think it adheres to the same analysis that you're going to use for your argumentation or for your narrative, but it's the specific thing of, that's why I put it in like, quote, aesthetically preferable, right? So this has supposed the romanticization of the starving artist narrative. So when we say that something is romanticized, or it sort of brings you this feeling of like, like you're in a movie and your life in this point in time is aesthetically wonderful. And that's what appealing to, that's what is nice to people, right? So you can be like a starving artist, but we see him in the streets of Paris and, you know, fighting for something that he believes in. And that is beautiful, or like aesthetically beautiful, this image of this person, or us romanticizing the act of something. So I wanted to give you guys sort of these hints or words that you can use. So when obviously you're going to have to define this in a round, what do you mean by glorifying, idealizing, or romanticizing something? These are just slight nuances and slight differences. And I think it sort of gives you like a cheat sheet of words to use so that the judge and everyone else knows what does glorification, idealization, romanticization mean in the context of whatever narrative you're discussing.
I
Now, there
have
are
a
two things.
question on that.
Yes.
For example, glorification and romanticization could be exchanged in the examples that you've provided, right? So let's say I have to make an example motion for a practice debate, or let's say I have to debate on it. How does the argumentation differ, let's say, if the motion mentions glorification or romanticization?
That's what I said. It doesn't change largely. Like all of these, and that's why they're in the same slide, right? And that there are two other things that are very important for these specific clashes that I'm going to go into right now. They all are basically similar, right? So it is in all three instances, you know, making something look better than it is, or just, you know, giving praise, or, you know, being infatuated with something. That stays, and I think the argumentation stays. Just the thing is, teams very often do have a, you know, especially OG, or if OG doesn't do it, or if, you know, you're a poor closing and your opening didn't do it, for your case to be stronger and for everyone to understand the nuances of argumentation, you have to know how to define these things. And although I agree with you that in terms of argumentation, there are very, very similar, and they have specific niches, which are the two other things on the slide. This is just a sort of like, as I said, a cheat sheet so that you know how to define them in a few seconds at the beginning of your PM, LO, whatever.
Yeah. Okay.
Just because they're slightly different, they mean the same thing, but there are some differences that I wanted to point out. I hope this answers your question. Cool. So what is then important about all three of these motions is to ask yourselves, okay, why do we need these? So why do we need to glorify something or idealize something? So what are the obstacles in the status quo that, you know, couldn't be crossed without us having this empowering narrative of us glorifying someone or romanticizing someone? So intuition pump here would be, well, being a starving artist is probably not good because you're starving. But if you're going to end up in that situation anyway, we would like these people to at least feel good about their situation, if that is an aesthetically pleasing type of life they want to live in, right? So there would be a lot of other obstacles, but if they are going to be a starving artist, then we need this sort of strong romanticization of that life for them to feel okay with being the starving artist, right? So for individuals to fully enjoy or grasp whatever benefits there are in the round, you have to ask yourself how you're going to prove that you need these sort of strong pushes for people to enjoy the benefits. And we're going to have a quick exercise on that. But secondly, which very often happens, I think in basic narrative rounds, but these ones, it's more often, the coercion clash. So coercion meaning like that something is, you know, something you're pushed to do something, like not necessarily like against your will, like we're not forcing it, but like we're not giving you any other option, or this looks so wonderful that you're not going to think twice and you will definitely want to do it. And I want to make this very clear, right? So you do have to ask yourself in these clashes, well, to what extent are we coerced? Because obviously, if something is glorified, it's very intuitive to think, oh, but then everyone will want to do it, right? Just everyone is going to completely buy into this narrative, meaning that they're not going to think twice if they actually want to be a mom, or they're not going to think twice if they want to be a starving artist. And I think there are two ways to sort of deal with that clash. The first one is to approach and be very realistic. It's sort of mitigate this sort of coercion attack, which is, I might really want to be a mother because everyone has told me since I was like 5 that being a mom is great, but I still have to carry a child for 9 months. It's like something I'm going to do with the first guy I meet and be like, whoop, I am now a mother because, you know, I've watched a lot of films. Like, to also be very realistic and be like, look, once you're a mother, you're going to need this glorification because it is a difficult process, but you're just not going to jump straight into it because individuals do know how to an extent, make rational decisions about their life. So it's not only being a mother, but also I have to have money for that. I have to be healthy. I have to, have a child in my stomach for 9 months. So it's always try to mitigate the amount of coercion that is always going to come with these three types of motions. But secondly, and a very simple response is, because if someone wants to claim agency as a principle, whatever, but you're going to be coerced in how to make your own decisions. Probably everything that has ever happened to you in your life has coerced you in one way or the other, right? So every narrative is coercive. So we can say that, yeah, it's probably, glorification of motherhood is coercive because it makes you want something. But there's also a narrative which says, we glorify monogamy, or we glorify, I don't know, going to the academia, whatever, right? So probably everything that, all of the narratives, and there's a million narratives around us, coerce us in one way or the other. Therefore, the margin of coerciveness or taking away your agency is probably marginal. I think that is like a go-to response always in these types of clashes, because sort of mitigates the harm that you're creating, or at least it equalizes it. But I think the first response that I gave in terms of, well, people do actually think with their heads, is just that once you're in this process, this helps you, is a strategically, I think, good response to avoid someone pushing on you, well, this is terrible because this. The reason why I gave you these sort of responses is because I think, especially for novices, or when you have to defend glorifying, idealizing, romanticizing, like, you always do ask, it's much easier for opposition to just say, well, that is bad because people are just going to jump in no matter what, and then my harms are 100% correct. And I think it's more difficult on teams that have to defend these three, types of approaches to sort of, be like, well, listen. So, but you always have to strive towards being probably, realistic and tangible, and imagine real people in real situations. They can care about narratives. They also care about having a job, having money, being happy, having someone to go to, and the end of the day, So these are the things I would like you to keep in mind in these specific types of motions. And there is this time a quick exercise. So the motion is, this house regrets the glorification of immediate post-colonial leaders in sub-Saharan Africa. I would just like to take a couple of minutes, but look, don't give me arguments. What I want is, why do you think that the glorification was really important for post-colonial leaders in sub-Saharan Africa, right? What was the status quo, and how would you defend this idea that, oh, no, but we actually really needed to glorify these individuals? They would not just be great based on them being post-colonial leaders. We have the last thing that we wanted to discuss. Oh, no, before that, spicy rules to keep in mind, which I think are some fancy tips to sort of build your argumentation around in general. I just wanted to cover them after we've established what all the words mean and how we approach characterization, etc. So the first thing, very often these motions, as you've probably seen in my examples, are regrets motions. This house regrets. What is then very crucial, obviously, for you to think about is the counterfactual. So to ask yourself, what is then the most likely or reasonable alternative to this narrative? How you approach this is that you ask yourself, okay, what are the benefits that I still want to keep on my side when I regret this specific narrative and I remove it from being relevant? But then what do I also want to avoid from opposition, let's say, to push a burden on me that I have to defend as the alternative? To put it in simple words, this is why I have an example. So this was Doxbridge 3. This house regrets the narrative that the process of overcoming illness, e.g. cancer, is a fight. And I think it's more difficult on governments that have to regret, because it's so very intuitive to us and so ingrained into us that, this is a terrible thing, like you're literally dying. Of course, we're going to tell you that you're a fighter, that this is your illness is an enemy and that you are going to overcome it, and every single step makes you stronger and all of the things that matter, right? So then you ask yourself in government, like, fuck, what is the realistic counterfactual or the narrative or my sort of alternative to this if they're not fighters? So then you sit and ask yourselves, okay, so what are my problems with people that have a serious illness believing that they are fighters. You know, what is the context of a fight in this round? So how do we analyze the narrative of a fighter? Is that, you know, let's say this illness is an enemy, but your strength as a person comes in overcoming it, right? So what does that look like then? So that's probably, you know, even when you have setbacks, or we know when your chemo is not working, or when you feel worse, that you still sort of have to tell yourself, oh no, but I can push through it. I have to be strong. It probably also tells you that, you know, for you to be strong and, you know, you don't want to be a burden to other people, you probably have to be a strong fighter and fight against it. The problem with this narrative is, although it sounds very empowering and very nice, how many people that are genuinely struggling with a terminal illness can genuinely claim that they are strong? Because in some instances, they are struggling. They probably do want to talk about it, and they are afraid of being a burden. But the entire society is telling them, no, this is your fight. And this is the fight that you're going to win. But when people feel like they can't win, that is when this narrative screws them over. So that is the first step of you approaching this house regrets and a very funky sort of narrative that is counterintuitive to us, to be like, okay, first I'm going to pinpoint the issues of this narrative. And if you saw how I analyze now the issues with the fighting narrative, in the back of my mind, I was going through the first 5 steps that we'd covered at the beginning of the workshop, right? What are the sentences? Who is telling me this? What expectations I'm going to put on myself? I don't know if you noticed, but all of the examples were sort of those based on like the first 3 crucial steps that then dictate the behavior. Are they going to isolate more? And all of these things. So that is the first step. Now, you have to ask yourself, okay, so I still want them to be empowered to some extent, because this is a terrible thing. And that's something that oppositions definitely still have to some extent. But also I want to erase this burden on them. Like they have to adhere to a norm. And I talked to a lot of people. Personally, I was closing government in that round and talked to the other governments. What was your counterfactual here, right? So, and I've heard a lot of those. I'm going to give you 2 examples that I think could be run in these sorts of instances. So if you have a problem with a narrative, you know, sort of, or dictating to people that have an illness, or dictating them to do something that is difficult, the most reasonable approach is to be, my counterfactual that is most likely to happen is that we are not going to tell them they are fighters. We're going to allow them to define for themselves what their struggle is, right? Now that, so what you're then saying is, and it's a cheeky one, but in these sort of more, I would say, I think it's a great motion, but I think it's sort of more difficult for one side. You have to find your niche to win. So it's like, okay, I'm still giving them the ability to choose for themselves if they want to be a fighter or if they want to be a victim. That's completely fine as well. But I'm giving them the choice or the ability to adhere to one narrative or the other. We're not pushing them to, in most instances, feel like they have to be a fighter. So that was a cheeky way of you still allowing them to be fighters if they want, but also if they are victims, they can. How would you probably prove the likelihood of your any cheeky counterfactual that you're running is to say that humans are complex. Not everyone will want to be a fighter. Not everyone is going to want to be a victim, but having an overwhelming narrative that is just going to be pushed onto these specific individuals that have such a complex state of literally dying from an illness is something that probably they're going to have different opinions on. And since they're the ones framing the narrative, my counterfactual is most likely to look like this. So my counterfactual is most likely to be, some of them are going to say they're fighters, some of them are going to say they're victims, but it's going to be probably their choice because the different types of humans are going to create the narrative differently. What you're then avoiding is burden pushing from opposition, that they're going to be like, oh, but then if you do not have the fighters, it's intuitive to say they're all going to be victims, right? No. So you see, we've already preempted this. They can be a victim if they want, because that's also completely fine if you feel like a victim of something you've never had the ability to influence. So you are a victim to some extent, but you also can be a fighter, but it does sort of give you a choice. So I wanted to have here a bit of a more nuanced approach in a regrets motion, and how when we're dealing with a counterfactual, to sort of to pinpoint the issues with the narrative that you're removing. And then secondly, try to figure out what are the benefits that you still want to claim on your side. And then thirdly, realize how to combine the two in your counterfactual. So in whatever you think is going to be the most likely alternative, and then give intuition pumps why your alternative is the most likely one and not everyone is going to be a victim, which in this instance has been covered. These people are probably the ones building this narrative, and these humans are just generally complex, and I don't think they can adhere to one or the other. So I hope this makes sense. I wanted to go a bit more into nuance into this because very often choosing a wrong counterfactual, especially, it can not only harm you, let's say, or if your CG and your OG was like a bit meh, to know how to be the binary decision of if you have a excellent case or if your case has a question mark, and we're like, but we don't know what to compare your argumentation to, right? Steps. Secondly, very harmful even if people don't buy into them. The narrative is a narrative that we should stay productive during lockdown, or if you want to go a bit more simple, just this house opposes the narrative of maximizing, not even lockdown, maximize productivity in general. Intuitive Gov says, but then people are going to be overworked. People are going to, sort of burn out, and they're always going to feel like they have to do all of these things and they can't. Completely fair argumentation, but that's only one part of the scope. One part of the demographic that you're dealing with in that round, which always I find it to be a cheeky extension in narrative rounds, is a narrative exists. A narrative can be a dominant narrative for all it matters, but the problem is there are many ways in which a narrative is not accessible, right? So there are many ways in which I just can't be productive or I can't maximize productivity, right? My room, four walls, like I mostly like scrolling through social media, like I feel the entire world is gone to shit, I don't know what I'm gonna do. Or generally, like people like to, not invest themselves so much in their job, but they still want to have free time, they still want to do all of the, like, or people sometimes have mental illnesses or just cannot bring themselves to do things. They might be procrastinators, whatever. There's so many reasons why any narrative is not accessible to someone. And then you pinpoint who the someone is. So based on all of these just examples that I've thrown out, based on these like productivity emotions, why it's difficult to be productive, and then say, but imagine how people feel when, here are all the barriers that I have, and everyone else around me glorifies this productivity, right? Or everyone else is productive. You see on social media, like people posting their new office spaces, influencers like exercising all the time in the pandemic, whatever. And then you feel like, oh, but I can't do it, so I'm not good enough, because this is the metric that society puts on me. So very often, although you can immediately pinpoint harms, if you think that just the narrative is, ugh, and then you're like, well, here are my 3 reasons why people buying into this narrative is harmful, you can always have an even if, or have that as an extension, which is why this narrative is not accessible. And then you're going to say, if you're opposing a lot of individuals, and then also it's also intuitive to the romantic, or they just have had friends, blah. So many ways in which people do not think that romantic life is accessible to them. So imagine how these people feel when a romantic partner that fulfills us this narrative exists because the narrative was not accessible. So that is a cheeky second thing. Thirdly, we're not in a vacuum. Need narratives. So to go back, because now I've sort of demolished the gov on this house opposes the narrative that we should stay productive during lockdown. Why do we need to stay productive during lockdown? Why do people generally need to stay productive, maximum productivity? Let's say you're opposition here, and you have that. Well, again, very simple, similar with glorification. What are the obstacles, or why do I need this? You can also spin it into a positive way. So why are people going to feel fulfilled by this narrative? And I think a good thing to run from opposition here in terms of productivity. Look, very often humans in a capitalist society do define themselves by their work, right? They define themselves by their career. Since we're 18, we're told that we have to, choose a career, always need to have a stable job, and then you can build on everything else. Just have money, and then you can do your hobbies, then you can go out, then you can have love, whatever. But very often when you grow up, just believing that your career and productivity and money matter, you can only feel satisfied when you're fulfilling that narrative. And then if Olja from 2 minutes ago was correct, and it's very, very difficult to stay productive during lockdown, well, then people are going to feel like shit because they always feel like they want to stay productive, but they can't. So we need a narrative that is going to tell them, look, it is good, even though it's hard. You create some sort of sense of support, some sense of community. We co-opt the inaccessibility of being productive, but then say, because humans already have incentives and have other narratives that make them want to be productive, but they can't because of government's framing, then you specifically need a narrative for them to ever reach the benefits of feeling good about being productive, fulfilling their job, and then like getting a promotion in their. Lastly, what benefits can you accrue from narratives that are a bit more tangible, not just humans emotionally falling apart? It's very simple. I think the first one is policy changes, right? Is dominant, and a lot of people do buy into it. So specifically, let's say, this house opposes the glorification of motherhood, and then you're in opposition. What you can say is, but look, if a lot of people obviously do respect mothers and we do believe that they're amazing or whatever, then we can push for governments to have like a better maternity leave, right? So they get paid maternity leave because it's something that we do glorify, and it's amazing that they chose to be mothers, and it's amazing they have the ability to do it. So therefore, we can push for policy that allows these mothers to have more money in their pocket, right? Because more people believe in it. Something that politicians want to campaign on, the basic public pressure argument insert. Support. I think support is something that very often people overlook, which is because you can suffer and you can enjoy a narrative in a vacuum, but very often you get the impacts of these based on other people around you, right? So if I'm struggling, it's very good to have a community of people that from this narrative that everyone buys in. Well, like we're all in this together, like the productivity during lockdown, we're all working, we're all suffering equally, but or very often you can use it in a cheeky way. If the narrative is not accessible and you're struggling because everyone to access support, and support is very relevant because you're going to feel ashamed. You're not going to want to say to someone, oh, I haven't done anything for like 3 days and just laid in my bed because other people buy into the narrative. And we're like, well, you have to stay productive or you're going to lose your mind. So always question how support, or can people feel comfortable talking to other people so that they have support, or is the support going to come with the narrative also that's going to be very important because humans do care about their friends, lovers, family, etc. So these are the spicy rules that are going to ensure that you're going to win. And then lastly, quickly on social movements, because I think this just sort of combines everything. Just now we're looking at social movements. So we're going to analyze these 4 questions based on the motion that I provided in the end, which is, this house believes that the feminist movement should advocate for the abolition of the traditional family unit. Okay, first question. Well, who buys into the social movement already? So who is this for? Obviously, feminist movement probably mostly impacts liberal women who already sort of do buy into the narrative, because with all the cool things like you don't need a man, go get a job, whatever. Most likely in the liberal bubble, those are going to be more liberal women. Therefore, the feminist movement probably impacts them. Therefore, this narrative or advocation, in this case for abolition of the traditional family unit, is going to appeal to those women. Why was this crucial to sort of pinpoint that who the receiver of the narrative is because then you can avoid opposition being like, oh no, but you're going to alienate conservative probably doesn't impact these women because they probably don't buy into this movement to begin with, or if it's like an eco movement or whatever. Just think about who the demographic of the social movement is. Secondly, is this narrative aligned with the principles of the movement? Because very often people just sort of like, you know, I think struggle with principles, but I think they're very relevant specifically for social movements, specifically for any advocation or any narrative that a social movement is pushing, right? Because the social movement, they place the obligation on themselves. They place the principle of representing someone at the point where they are a social movement of a specific group, right? So if you're a feminist movement, you have accepted the obligation that you are going to support all women, or you're going to take care of all women. So you can then ask this question, and then if you're in the opposition, be like, well, principally this would have been problematic because you as a feminist movement have accepted to always push for things that are going to help all women or everyone, all people who identify as women, and then you're abolishing a traditional family unit that still a lot of women probably want to be a part of and have a husband and have kids, and you're pushing them away. So this is not, the narrative is not principally justified with your stance that you have taken as a movement, which also it could be like an LGBTQ movement, etc. Third question, to what extent does it impact its followers based on the you see it says abolition of traditional family unit, and what do? You go back to the 5 things of characterization, and that's how you have a strong argument, right? Because then you're going to be like, okay, what are the sentences they're going to promote, right? Who are the celebrities? How are we going to interact with this social media message? Am I now going to feel better because I feel like, oh, I don't have a burden on me to have a husband and to have a kid and all of these things? How am I going to act? Perfectly, once you've pinpointed who is the receiver of this narrative, and how is it going to impact them? Always the basic 5 principles at the beginning. And then lastly, how will it impact the movement? Because that's also very important. Is the narrative going to draw more people in, or is the narrative going to alienate more people? And I think that is sort of the basic clash that always happens, right? So are people going to be mad about it because it's radical and the conservatives are not going to like it, or is it? I think people have to be then very realistic because it is a social movement debate. You have to outline to what extent is a social movement capable of ever doing something, right? I remember it was the Zagreb Euros Open Final 2014, 2015. I can't remember. And it was like, this house believes that the feminist movement should advocate for like stopping interventions or something like that. Something very similar, like military stuff. And it took the CO member to be like, can we acknowledge that not a lot of people actually listen to feminist movements? It's probably just like sort of liberal women. I'm not sure why any leader ever would listen to the feminist women and be like, I'm not going to intervene. You know, it was the power of the framing of being like, who are the recipients of this narrative, which brings you back to the first one, because that is how you then resolve the impact clash, or are people going to be angry, or are people going to or affects these people in this sort of way, it brings them benefits but doesn't alienate anyone, that's probably good. I think then, of course, on opposition, you're going to say, well, this is not, obviously there are going to be people and women that are going to be alienated, which probably is not principally abhorrent based on what this movement stands for, but also how are these women going to feel? You can then mitigate the narrative by saying also there are other narratives for liberal women to sort of feel fine with not having a husband or not being a housewife. They don't need to advocate for abolishing the traditional all of those 5 steps in the last one. But are we how narratives interact and how we can weaponize them to mitigate or empower the impacts specifically for social movements? Because it's very an already outlined incentive, and you know what the feminist movement cares about, those specific 5 frameworks for a narrative round in social movement debates. That's it for me on the official part of the workshop. I have here provided a link, and also that we're going to have it sent out the PowerPoint where you can find me on Facebook if you want to ask me any questions, have any type of discussions on debating life, whatever, you can just text me on Messenger. And I've also done like Hadar's workshop if you want to go more into detail about, more specific, like sort of rebuttal wise and weighing wise in certain clashes. That's a bit longer, a bit in detail.